The Day the Soldiers Came by Robin Bales. This story was originally published in Voices of Imagination, an anthology of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. 1. Della had been living in the brothel for several months when the soldiers came. Most days he was to be found comfortably slouched in the corner of the ground floor reception room, his charcoal in his hand and his sketch pad rested against an upraised knee. He drew the clientele as they came and went, taking pleasure in reproducing the elaborate patterns on their fine robes. He drew the girls in their various attitudes of repose as they waited for business, trying to catch that subtle shift as they went from personal to professional when someone walked through the door. Sometimes he looked out of the wide-open door to draw the constant stream of foot traffic or the other buildings of the pleasure quarter. The down-curved roof of the bar opposite dipped gracefully into his sightline and made part of a pleasing frame for the central image. Whether any of these drawings were any good or might be worth something to someone other than himself he did not know, but he was young yet and, with a few sales under his belt, he considered himself to be luckier than most artists at the beginning of their careers. The human soldiers made little fuss when they entered the pleasure quarter, though they obviously attracted more than a few interested looks. By this time, almost a year after the humans had first arrived on their planet, most Marmorans had seen these fascinating aliens on the news, but they were still a relatively rare sight in the flesh for those outside of the central government. Rare enough at least to cause a stir when they went out onto the streets. Certainly, it was the first time that Della had seen one, so to see several together, he counted 10, was a real opportunity, and one he was not about to let slip. He headed to the open door, pad in hand, and sketched the strange figures as they approached. All but one of them wore the grey body armor and protective helmets that were so ubiquitous that they seemed to be uniform for the species and not just its soldiery. They carried their weapons as casually as Della carried his charcoal, their movements were easy and careless, and occasionally one would voice some observation in their harsh, clumsy language that would make the others rattle with their curious laughter. Della sketched a series of lightning-quick stick figures down the side of his pad to try to record the human gait. It seemed so unnatural, so ungainly, and yet they appeared to move without difficulty. The 10th human wore a darker padded vest of some sort, presumably protective, but his head was bare, revealing those incongruous human features that Della quickly, and not entirely successfully, strove to reproduce on his pad: the small, lidded eyes, wide mouth, pale skin. Such soft creatures, no wonder they needed the armor. The bare-headed man carried a device of some sort, a black, rectangular box, into which he talked, apparently recording his observations of the district and its inhabitants. Any questions he had, he directed to the Marmoran interpreter and guide who accompanied them. It had proved easier for Della's people to learn the humans' alien language than vice versa. Though the party acted like mere sightseers, Della, with his artist's eye, could not help noticing an underlying unease. The humans were unable to completely mask their contempt for the district and its purpose. Della could practically smell their distaste on them. Why they should feel such distaste Della could not imagine, and whether or not it had anything to do with the reason for their unexpected visit he could not guess. He merely recorded what he saw with his charcoal, the 10 figures in their armor, the weapons in their hands, the hunched unease of their stance. With hard-scored lines of the charcoal he added, on the shoulder of each figure, the jet-black personal cameras that each soldier wore, recording the pleasure district as he did, but in their own silent, uncompromising fashion. As he did so, one camera swiveled to look directly at him for a moment before moving on to its next target. When the soldiers had gone, Della sketched in the rest of the familiar pleasure district around the dark figures on his pad. The elegant curves of the Marmoran buildings looked oddly ethereal next to the blocky solidity of the soldiers, ephemeral and ghost-like. 2. Regular flashes of brilliant white burst across the ceiling of the little cell, telling Della that yet another bomb had gone off. He sat up, back to the wall. It was impossible to sleep through this anyway. As if to underline this observation, a vast explosion lit the room and seemed to shake the building. Della felt like cheering. Yes. Blow it up, bring the whole place crashing to the ground. It had been built centuries ago by his ancestors, but now that the humans had moved in and made the place their own, destruction was all this old edifice was fit for. The room he had occupied for the last few months, he thought, had once no doubt been larger, the half-timbered walls curved and painted. But these open spaces had been lined in stone and divided up into hundreds of cells to accommodate the ever-expanding number of prisoners. All that met Della's eyes in every direction was grey stone. Grey, it seemed to him, was the color of the humans. A bright flash lit the room again, searing Della's eyes and forcing him to hide his face in his hands. He did not like to close his eyes, the same images always lurked behind the closed lids, waiting for him. It was not as if the brothel had been his home for a long time, but to see it burn. Perhaps it was more that it, and the district in which it had stood, had been an unchanging part of the landscape in the city in which he had spent his whole life as a child. He had passed the pleasure district every day as he walked to school. Or perhaps it was that the pleasure district had represented a clear difference between the two species. It had been something that was wholly Marmoran in its cultural ideology. And that of course had sealed its fate. To the humans, it represented, as did so many aspects of Marmoran life, something rotten at the core of that culture, something that required changing, change for which the Marmorans would surely thank them someday. Change was something for which the humans seemed to live, another striking difference between the two species. It was not merely his presence in the brothel which had led to Della being locked up here. In fact, that had had very little to do with it. It was his age. Many of the elder Marmorans had dealt with the humans' continued encroachments on their society and way of life as they had dealt with most problems in the past. They had done nothing, waiting for things to improve of their own accord. That was the Marmoran way. But such tactics, however tried and tested by time, had proved ineffective against the unusually sudden change that the humans brought. No one in Marmoran society was equipped to deal with the unseemly speed with which the humans thought and acted, but the young at least tried. They staged demonstrations, formed resistance cells and started to hit back at their civilizers. As a result, being of Della's age and gender almost guaranteed a Marmoran being taken into preventative custody. By standing on the hard wooden bed and stretching as high as he could, Della found he could reach the bars on his window and haul himself up so that he could see out. The sight that met his eyes was like one out of an apocalyptic fable. His city was burning. There was the dome of the temple, slowly caving like an egg rotting from the inside. There was the great library, smoke billowing from beneath its eaves. And there was the National Gallery, the building in which Della had dreamed that his paintings might one day hang, now almost entirely reduced to ash. There were now so many fires that they had changed the color of the sky. For a fleeting moment of madness, Della wondered at how beautiful that sky looked. It barely mattered now which side won. Life would never be the same again. It seemed inconceivable that Marmoran society, which had stood, unchanging and unchangeable for the last 5 centuries, could live through this. Della dropped back to the bed. Although there was a sick feeling in his stomach, there was also a burning desire in his heart to record that image, the burning city, the extraordinary sky. But his pad and charcoal had been taken from him. It could wait, it was not like he could forget. 3. The screams from behind pushed Della to run faster. He wheeled off right, a map of the city unfolding in his mind, across Salone Square and past the Memorial Gardens. He could lose them in the old arcade. Whole or burnt, this would always be his city, no human could take it from him. He knew that tomorrow the news broadcasts, along with the pamphlets and posters designed to turn the minds of the general populace, would report the civilian deaths. They would decry the resistance fighters as brutal, unfeeling animals who targeted the innocent. Part of Della agreed with them. He tried to stifle that internal voice of dissent with the recited polemic that no human was innocent. But it was not enough. He was an artist, though he had not drawn anything for years. He was not a soldier, guerrilla or otherwise. And yet he had felt almost obligated to join the fight. Not just because it was the resistance who had rescued him, but because of what he had seen that night from his prison cell, because of what had become of the pleasure district, and for 100 other reasons. It was not hard to find reasons to hate the humans, but it was still hard to reconcile those reasons with the acts that he was forced to commit. A shot rang out, and Della suddenly felt his right leg give way beneath him. At first, it was a curious sensation, as if all the muscles had spontaneously decided to take a break. Then came the searing pain and with it the realization that he had been shot. Della crashed to the dirt but was soon struggling up again, fighting off the pain. He could hear voices from behind him, and they were getting closer. Some said that the humans took no prisoners, but that was a lie. They always took prisoners. A dead Marmoran told them nothing. A live one would tell them much, eventually. Though the truth was that there was little left to learn. The resistance was all but broken. The war, such as it was, would be over soon with the humans victorious. Yet the resistance continued. Why? Perhaps out of fear. That the humans would win in the end had seldom been in doubt, but what would happen next? That was something no one could predict. A ragged hole in a burnt-out shop wall caught Della's eye and he made for it as fast as his bleeding leg would allow. He collapsed into the darkness and drew back as far as he could, his shoulder blades pressed against the charred woodwork. Outside he could hear fast-moving footsteps and voices shouting in those same unpleasant tones that he had noted that day in the brothel. It seemed so long ago now. And how the picture had changed. 4. The clothes still felt very strange to Della. Perhaps not uncomfortable, not really. But certainly strange. Constrictive. He reached for his stick and made for the door of his little apartment. Outside in the street, the clothes still felt strange, but he no longer felt the sense of betrayal that had overwhelmed him the first time he had put on the human clothes. It was now so common as to be almost the norm. The other day he had seen human children pointing and laughing at an older Marmoran in traditional dress. It had brought a pang to Della. That day he had felt a traitor, had wanted to tear his own clothes from his back there and then as a show of solidarity with the old man. But he had just walked on. Perhaps it was an attitude that developed with age, or perhaps he was just done fighting. Despite himself, Della was excited today. That too raised feelings of betrayal from within him as he walked along the once familiar streets that now seemed to sprout new and unfamiliar buildings daily. It was wrong for him to be so enthused by his destination. But he could not help it. He was an artist and, no matter how he struggled against the emotion, the opportunity to see art that had come from another world was a thrilling one. Previews he had read, written both by humans and by his own people, had been more than promising. A selection of paintings and sculptures encompassing the last 3 millennia of human history had been shipped here from Earth, including some that represented the absolute peak of human artistic achievement. As a Marmoran, Della might feel guilty for relishing the prospect, but the artist within him could not resist. The gallery was one of the many new buildings in the city, and as one of the most recent, this would be its first exhibition. It was more of an amalgam of styles than were those built directly after the establishment of the joint government. Those early buildings had been predominantly, almost exclusively, human in their aspect, and they had sat very strangely on the city's horizon. Now the influences were about 50-50, a squat, human block of a building dressed in the subtle curves and elegant slopes of a Marmoran one. When Della arrived he found a long queue standing outside the gallery, about 3/4 of them in human clothing. It was the first day of the exhibition and it had been decided that, since it was their first chance to see human art, today the gallery would be open to Marmorans only. It is possible that security was also a consideration. Clashes between the two species were still common. Della noted the now familiar grey-clad figures strolling along the front of the building, each keeping a hand on his weapon and an eye on the growing queue. The feed from their shoulder-mounted cameras was no doubt being scrutinized back at their base for anything remotely suspicious. Della experienced a pang of déjà vu as, briefly, one relentless glass eye lighted on him as he limped up to take his place at the end of the queue. He wondered if the man viewing that feed would have noted his limp. There were many similar injuries around these days, and the vast majority meant the same thing, war wound. If any of the soldiers on duty entertained such suspicions, they made no mention of it. Nor would they. War was no longer the word used to describe the turbulent years that had followed the arrival of the humans. It was the period of instability. Even the history books used that term and had already begun to reflect this selective view of what had happened, an uncomfortable start to what was destined to become an equal partnership of races. 5. Inside the gallery, the invited guests sipped their expensive drinks and nibbled on their expensive food as they took in the selection of paintings. Della watched with pride his first exhibition. It had taken longer than he would have liked, longer than he would have dreamed possible in those distant days of living in the brothel in the old pleasure district, on the site of which this new National Gallery of Marmoran art had been constructed, but it was welcome nonetheless. If Marmorans knew nothing else, then they knew how to wait. What was most fascinating was the number of humans here, and the fact that they, he knew, would be the main purchasers of his work. Marmoran art, old and new, was enjoying tremendous popularity on the distant Earth. Whatever Della saw fit to charge he would probably get. They were such a fast species, Della considered, perhaps because their lifespan was so short. They were so swift to move on and forget the deaths on both sides only a generation since. They now sought diligently to preserve a culture they had once, not so long ago, sought to destroy. They decried the loss of irreplaceable indigenous treasures and bemoaned the fact that they themselves would never be able to walk through the old pleasure district, soaking up its sounds, its smells, its atmosphere. And they saw no hypocrisy in this. It was a facet of the species that Della had grudgingly come to love. But the human speed, it seemed, was infectious. Change was all around these days, and Della himself was far from immune. He was back in traditional Marmoran garb tonight and found that he was wearing it more often in general. It was fashionable again, no longer taboo, no longer causing laughter in the street or getting you unwanted attention from the government or security services. In fact, a good 2/3 of the invited guests in the room were in Marmoran clothes, many of them human. People said that things were getting back to normal, and Della had actually started to wonder if they were right. It was only when he thought about it that he remembered just how much had happened, how much they had, as a nation, chosen to block out from their cultural memory, how much had changed. Things were not as they were, they never would be, but they were at least better. There were no more soldiers to be seen on the streets. "What is this one?" a well-dressed human woman politely inquired, and Della was quick to join her in front of one of his paintings. Just a memory. The human language, once an ugly mystery, now seemed almost natural to him. The woman nodded, hoping for more but willing to accommodate an eccentric artist. It has a sense of calmness and yet foreboding. The human male who now joined them was an art critic. Most perceptive, said Della, and meant it. They learnt quickly, too. As if something is on the horizon, the man continued. A shadow ready to pass over and engulf it all. A beautiful day but with storm clouds brewing. It's as if you were there, smiled Della before moving on to talk to some of his other guests. What is it called? The woman asked the critic. She was considering a purchase and it might be nice to know what she was buying. The man bent to examine the title on the frame before intoning, with barely a trace of an accent, Kamela Kahari Keech. What does that mean? The day the soldiers came.